Ready, I can tell. Well, thank you everyone for being here and for the opportunity that you're providing for candidates to talk to you. It's really important for us. I do wish my opponent were here because I think voters always get a better understanding of the choices they have in an election when they hear from all the candidates. We did expect that he'd be here, so I'm sorry that he's not. I'm Emily Tracy. I'm running for the state senate, and I want to be a strong voice in the legislature for the rural and resort communities of northwest Colorado. With the partisan gridlock that we talk a lot about the federal government and how things just don't happen in Congress anymore, but we have a little bit of that problem in the state legislature also. With the partisan gridlock and the extreme ideology that is evident there and has been particularly in the most recent session, the important needs of this part of the state are often overlooked. There are many issues important to the people who live here. You all represent one of those important issues, and that is the strength of the middle class and the ability of the middle class to buy homes. I mean, it's at the core of the nature of our country, I think. There are many other issues, whether it's tourism, whether it's agriculture, energy development, many other things, strong public education, and just good economic development in rural Colorado so that everything doesn't happen on the Front Range. So we know that to really have a strong voice in the legislature from this part of the state, we have to have someone who is ready to go to work in the legislature and speak on behalf of all of you. A little about my background. My maternal grandparents were farmers in northern Missouri. My paternal grandparents worked for the railroad, even in Cripple Creek, mostly in the state of Kansas, but even in Cripple Creek almost 100 years ago. I've lived in rural Colorado for 35 years and in Summit County for nearly 8 years now. I have more than 20 years of work experience in child protection and adoption. I still work part-time in the field of adoption, help design and implement a couple of major statewide systems. Also have worked in the court system in their mediation program, and I have a lot of experience doing training in conflict resolution. Year after year, rural and western slope Colorado fight to have their voices heard in state government. The legislature is dominated by urban and suburban legislators because of one man, one vote. And that's why it's so important that the people that you elect out here in this part of the state are the strongest, best representatives that you can have. Economically, I'm running into many, many issues as I talk with people, literally thousands of people in this district, 7 counties in northwest Colorado. Economic problems, problems with homes being underwater, insufficient jobs. We know there's a lot to work on. We know that we need a problem solver like me in the legislature to get to work across that partisan divide, and solve problems, get work done in the legislature. And that's why I'm running, and I would love to represent you all there. Thank you.
Your first question, jobs and the economy continue to be the #1 issue for voters across the state. If elected, what are your strategies for creating jobs on the western slope? And with the economy improving on the Front Range, what can you do to advocate for the western slope at the Capitol and ensure the legislature seeks opportunities for economic development and jobs to be funneled into our area?
It's a big concern of mine. I alluded to that a little bit in what I just said, that there's so much that happens in the Denver metro area and along the Front Range, and there's a lot of good things happening there, and overall it's good for the state that there is work bringing, whether it's industry or companies moving their headquarters to Colorado. But how much of that happens here? I mean, I don't know how much you see. I don't see a lot of it. We're all very dependent in this part of the state on the industries that I mentioned, whether it's ag, energy development, tourism, small business, and those kinds of things, service, teachers, and so forth. But we don't see major economic development efforts on the western slope. I think it's a huge gap, and I personally feel, maybe someone can convince me otherwise, I feel like the state has not really put much effort into this. And what I mean by effort is providing technical assistance to local communities so they know how to do economic development. They know how to strengthen their own local businesses. They know how to look for other businesses that would be a good fit. I don't think the state has played much of a role in that. I think unemployment rate, when I looked it up this morning online, the unemployment rate in this area is not too bad. It kind of followed the same trend that the rest of the state has followed. You might be just a little bit better shape than the statewide average. But there's so much more that could be done, and we have to understand Our local rural communities have to have a diversified economy. Summit County, where I live, struggles with this, and yet there's no county-wide economic development effort. And I think that's what we need to see much more of on a county level and on a regional level. I have experience years ago when I served on the city council in Canyon City. I served for 5 years on the economic development board that the county had. And that board played an instrumental role in not only putting together a small business incubator, but also in bringing, not that you want this here, but bringing the largest federal prison complex to Fremont County in southern Colorado. So that was done by efforts of economic developers and local folks sitting down at the table, figuring out what would work in that community. And I'd love to see those kinds of efforts happen all over this part of the state. I think it's really important for there to be many voices at the table when you're talking about jobs in the economy and what a community needs. It needs to be voters, it needs to be different sectors of the economy like realtors, it needs to be small business folks, it needs to be educators, it needs to be local government, of course, county commissioners, city and town council members, all at the table figuring out what works in our community. Garfield County is not the same as Routt or Summit or Grand or any of the other counties in the district I'm running in. But I think everyone sees the same problem, which is a weakening middle class, a lack of good jobs. People want to live in this part of the state because of the quality of life here, but they can't stay if they don't have good jobs to support their families with.
Give us your thoughts on energy development in Garfield County, and will you help promote it, and how will you get distribution of oil and gas to population centers?
This is kind of a tough question. I'm not an expert on transporting oil and gas, but I'm sure it's a part of the industry. Let me say, I think in Garfield County and in several other counties in the Senate district that I'm running in, which is all in northwest Colorado, energy development, oil and gas, coal, and other things is really an important part of the economy here. It's an important part of the economy of the region. And it's not going to go away. The demand, even with our recession, the demand for energy is always going to be there. I personally have a hard time thinking we'll ever go back to the days where we're running kerosene lamps or, having horse-drawn wagons. We're just not going to go back to that. So the demand is there. We're so fortunate in this part of the state to have these resources, whether it's oil, gas, and coal in the ground, or whether it's alternative energy resources, which are really available in many parts of Colorado, wind, solar, and so forth. So we're fortunate to have those resources. We're not going to walk away from them. I think we have to recognize that there's a role for all levels of government in this. The federal government has a role. State governments have a regulatory role, for example, through the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, and local government has a role. We have a heritage in Colorado of local control, and that plays out in certain ways. We like to govern ourselves locally, whether it's for schools or county commission, boards of county commissioners. We really like local control. People feel closest to their local government. And so part of that plays out in land use. I don't know if any of you remember Governor Lamb several decades ago. When he was governor of the state of Colorado, he tried to implement human settlement policies at the state level, deciding at the state level where communities would grow and where they wouldn't. You can imagine how popular that was in a state like Colorado. So we really like land use planning and zoning and some of those kinds of regulatory actions at the local level, and that's not going to change. And in some counties, that has played out in different ways. Some counties are using, for example, their 1041 powers to, as they are allowed to, and as is provided in law, to really look at the impacts of some of these developments. And so I think that's appropriate. I think it's also appropriate for folks to have a voice at the local level in how energy is developed in the same way as we look at any kind of development. Where and how do towns develop? What is the zoning going to be? What land use is appropriate in a certain part of a county and so forth. So I think it's important for that local voice to continue on. And in terms of transporting the product, whether it's oil, gas, or whatever, I think clearly that's something that is planned out by the industry, probably more than any of the rest of us. They know what they need, and hopefully the marketplace to a greater or lesser extent is taking care of that.
And your last question. The budget crisis continues in Colorado will continue to be the forefront during the next couple of years. What will be your approach in dealing with the budget shortfalls, How will you address the failing infrastructure, such as bridges and roads, and the I-70 congestion, when the budget does not provide funding to fix the problems? And what do you consider to be a critical shortfall?
It's a big problem, isn't it? I hate to use this analogy, but I can't help but think about the cute little story you hear about the frog that you put in water, and then you put the water on the stove and you turn on the heat. And I think our budget and our revenue stream and our funding at the state level in Colorado is kind of like that frog in the water. We've been doing things, particularly in the last 10 or 12 years. In the 20 years that we've had Tabor, it's just sort of happened gradually. But in the last 10 or 12 years, we've started borrowing from trust funds, temporarily withholding a benefit, whether it was the senior citizens property tax exemption or whatever it was, borrowing money, moving money around, reducing benefits, delaying, or doing gimmicks with the budget. And I don't think we can go much farther with that approach. And it's in the hands of the voters in Colorado. It's not in the legislature's hands, for better or worse, and there's probably really good reasons that it's in the hands of the voters. There's strong support for the provision in Tabor that says for any tax increase, the voter needs to approve that. What you've seen, though, is often at the local level, you've had those kinds of questions posed to you as voters, and then if there's a good reason for that tax increase or retaining additional revenue, then voters approve it. But you haven't seen much happen at the statewide level, have you? People just don't want to propose anything like that. But somehow, whether it's through the TBD Colorado process or some other process, we as voters in Colorado have got to decide what we want to do. And if we want sufficient funding for education, for state parks, for roads and bridges, where I used to live in Fremont County, they closed a state highway just a few months ago because a bridge collapsed. And it was a little two-lane state highway, but as we all know, living in rural Colorado, those little two-lane state highways are our lifeline. There's not an alternative route to a lot of these places. And so when a bridge collapses and a state highway closes, it's a major impact for people who live and work in those areas. We have to find a solution. But the only way to do that, I think, is two pieces. It's leadership from elected officials stepping forward and being willing to talk about the tough issues. And it's voters saying, okay, I know we voters have to be a part of the solution. And so we all need to get to the table and decide how to do this, but we don't want to see that frog get too hot in that water on the stove.
And I'm still trying to figure out what the hell that means. Okay. just an observation. Not politically either way, just trying to think about frog and water and taxes. Okay. Any questions from the group out here? Notice this one went a lot smoother because I was on top of this one a lot better, okay? I'm kidding. The last one went great. So, any questions from the masses out here? Again, you need to just stand up and be brave.
There we go. We got
Jack. Oh my God, Jack. A question.
You mentioned, as well as the candidates for District 57, mentioned the number of households that are underwater on the mortgage and the equity position in those homes. Do you have any thoughts or anything that you'd like to share with as far as you might have some approaches to remedy that situation?
I don't have a specific proposal for that other than if the situation continues, and maybe we're on a slight upward trend now. I'm not sure, when we hear about national numbers. But I know that home ownership is it's a core issue in our country. And it's like trying to preserve the mortgage interest deduction and how that's always an issue that pops back up at the federal level. So I think it's essential that we find ways to not just have this system where people have whatever temporary financial problem, they can't make their payments, the bank they foreclose, or there's a short sale or whatever it is. I think we have to find a way to try to keep people in their homes if it's appropriate at all. If there's a way to encourage, I don't know what that would look like necessarily, but a way to encourage banks and lenders to work with those folks a little bit better and communicate better with those homeowners. It does have an impact. I live in a real small neighborhood outside of Breckenridge, and It's a neighborhood, it's a deed-restricted neighborhood. It's mostly for local employees because, housing prices can be very tough on just regular employees in the community. And I think out of 13 units, there's been 2 foreclosures in the last several years. Well, that's, maybe that's not as bad as some communities, but that's a pretty serious impact on that small neighborhood. So I'd love to see how we can sort of, again, bring a lot of people around the table, sit down, figure out, well, where is this failing? Is it bad communication between lenders and borrowers, or is it another piece? And how can we bolster this so that we can keep people in their homes, get over this horrible housing bubble that has been such a major impact on our economy?
Thank you.
Any other questions? Summation, 2 minutes.
All right. Well, again, I do wish my opponent had been here. And I encourage you to take a look. There's some information on each of your tables about my campaign. There's also a website that's on the material. So I encourage you to take a look at that and certainly contact me in your community that you think it'd be important for me to know about. I alluded to this a little bit, and I really think, in my belief system, the middle class is the core strength of our country and our state. We've got to find a way to preserve a strong middle class. If we don't, the real estate industry can't function the way it has, and a whole lot of other businesses can't function. And I've worked with the Summit Chamber of Commerce both as a volunteer and as a part-time staffer, and had a lot of connection to small business there, and have quietly, or seen businesses quietly come and go because they can't make it for all kinds of reasons. Middle class creates the demand. We absolutely have to have a strong middle class to create the demand for housing and everything else that we live on. I want to be elected to serve as your state senator and be a problem-solving person, to go to the legislature in Denver, work across that partisan divide, and get things done. I think you have every right to expect that of your elected officials, and that's what I want to do. So I thank you again for the opportunity, and again, let me know if you have any questions you think of later. Thanks.
Let's give her a hand.